what I wanted to talk about today was sort of the journey we went through at Microsoft, and how I got kind of roped into trying to figure out the best approach for trying to get what is frankly a mess in what we call the voluntary markets in line to where we could get something that was usable and something that Microsoft would look to use to purchase and offsets and carbon offsets. Specifically, basically that journey started out with trying to do things in an open way. So what I want to walk through is, how we went and used the IWA, which evolved out of the EEA itself, and some of the frameworks and the lessons learned to bringing business people and non-technology people together to try to get a set of requirements and agreement to be able to just approach this thing. It's very tempting as technologists to go try to build a solution before you really understand it. And we had this opportunity in the IWA with some very passionate users and business people that went out into the market to try to do the right thing and purchase carbon credits and report emissions, and found that the ecosystem was just wholly a mess and untrustworthy. And they thought that, DLTs, and well, they didn't think that. They thought that, we could, they're not in the weeds on blockchain, but they thought that, multi-party approach, and saw that this was a multi-constituents coming in, and none of them would agree. And how could we try to address that? So let me go into the first thing that we did is, to try to tackle this big space of sustainability. So we tried to tightly scope down the area in which we wanted to address. So we focused on the voluntary carbon markets, which at the time, we thought we were, weren't really sure about it until this larger group called the Taskforce for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets spun up a couple of months later, and it's a much larger initiative that we were like, oh yeah, we're really going down the right path there. But one of the first things we noticed was that no one was speaking the same language. We had different terms and definitions for describing basically the life cycle of how does a carbon credit come about, and first off, what is a carbon credit? And you'd ask different people, and they would all have different answers, and then you stick the word voluntary in front of it. People had wildly different sort of definitions for what those things were. So first thing we had to do is just to get everybody to speak the same language. That's the babelfish analogy, and then really sort of get and attract business people into the working groups. And I'll show you some of the best practices for bringing folks in as technologists. We trying to pry solid set of requirements out of one organization is hard enough, much less when you get multiple parties together, all of them having different aspects to do with a larger workflow, and how you get them together to collaborate and get requirements out of them that don't conflict with each other, and get to agreement, turns out to be a very worthwhile exercise. And the IWA in the business working groups turns out to be a good place to do that. So the first thing we wanted to do is to get everyone together. We did this thing called a potluck, where people contributed their existing work, and we tried to come up with a sort of common glossary of terms and acronyms. So everyone was speaking the same language, and we could refer to, and we constantly edit that glossary that we share, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a bit. But then we really wanted to define the high level life cycle and get a common understanding for what's the cradle to grave process from, how does this intangible asset that people generically call a carbon credit, which can actually, in technical terms, is polymorphic. It can mean 4 different things depending on the context. How does that, become a thing, and then how does it move through to the point where it's actually retired and sort of and counted against the global carbon debt that we've racked up to be able to credit that on this larger global carbon ledger that does not exist, but to be able to get to a point where we could have something like that, we have to get the basics down. So clearly identifying roles, defining what the roles are in that life cycle, and then trying to go out, and even this voluntary carbon market's a big theme. So we wanted to then break it up into phases so that we could focus on each phase. And each phase, I'll go through them as quickly as I can. They all have roles and artifacts, and they have flows. And that's about as high level as we wanted to get. And what the goal of each of this was to come out with some draft specifications for tokens and contracts, which we try not to use those terms too much, but essentially in blockchain speak, we're coming up with token templates and contract templates that help facilitate someone to go implement these specifications. So ultimately, the goal is to get these requirements down so somebody can implement something that actually works, and then ultimately certify against that, so that we can start to have organizations working together. Pass to the next slide and talk about some of the things that we're going through the life cycle phases. Let's talk about the phases. So when we went through this, we tried to chop the work out so we could then, one of the reasons we broke up the phases is we needed to concentrate the subject matter experts from these various organizations, most of which I would say half of them were not blockchain sort of organizations. They were either in the supply chain, or they were a buyer, or they were an organization looking to get into supplying carbon credits. There's a whole bunch of different actors there. So the four phases we have is, first is verified supply. How do we cradle this thing? How do you create verified supply, a high quality supply of carbon credits? Then how do you establish demand for those supply? And we need to increase the communication. And one of the surprising things was the gap between what sellers thought buyers wanted and what buyers thought suppliers are bringing to market. Was a massive disconnect there, and sort of establishing how do we get clear demand signals to the suppliers so that they create product that they ultimately want to purchase. Then once you have supply and demand, you have to have some way of facilitating and matching them. So buying and trading, what should be some processes there. And then lastly, how do we offset and spend essentially, or burn carbon credits, but do it in a way that we can correlate it with our emissions reporting, going back to the demand signal, and sort of closing out the loop so that we can show the entire life cycle of a carbon credit from cradle to grave. So let's walk through what that looks like. The first phase we started out was, how do we get verified supply in there? I'm not going to read the slide to you. These slides will be available from the website. You can also read it on the GitHub for the Interwork Alliance is published. But these are some of the basic supply roles. You have a supplier, which actually turns out to be a little bit more complex. It's not just one person. It can be an owner, depending on what type of project it is, a sponsor and developer. A standard registry is sort of a legacy that their primary focus is to create standards for measuring, reporting, and verifying. That's an acronym called MRV. It's used a lot in ecological markets to be able to sort of issue claims of either carbon removal or carbon avoidance. And then that claim has to say, it's based on a standard saying, to be able to prove that I've removed carbon from the atmosphere, how do I prove that? What sort of things do I need to measure before and after, so that my claim can then be verified and turned into a carbon credit? The standards registries create those. This is the Veras and the gold standards of the world. Then the whole body of work that is verifying the claims. And this is a VVB, which is some people generally call it a verifier, shorthand. And they're essentially auditing claims, making sure the claims are, they get certified by the standard registries to do that work. And then ultimately the buyer is, trying to guide the demand signal. And so we start out with a high level, since we couldn't get together in person to do this on a whiteboard, this is sort of what the whiteboard looked like, was saying, here are the different roles: the project owner, the verifier, and the registry. And you can see like a project owner has this thing called a project, which we'll talk about next, which is essentially an identity to identify the source of claims. And it is contracted with a verifier to verify their claims. That ultimately gets created once verified into a token that is then granted to the project owner that they can then go try to sell. So high level flow there. We looked at the IWA frameworks. If you're not familiar with IWA, it starts out as a 3-layered sort of framework of tools that we use. And these tools are basically used to collect requirements, business requirements, in a standard reusable way. And make that short is these are composition frameworks where if one business requirement creates a behavior that is what we call offsettable, for example, or there's a whole bunch of these, but that one behavior can be defined in such a way that's reusable across token definitions. And in fact, we're looking at reusing those same types of things in the contract side. And typically you'll have tokens and contracts that manipulate those tokens hooking together using these types of reusable frameworks. It lets you sort of compose across use cases without starting from scratch, and it dramatically speeds these up. So we have some basic templates in the token. So we have 3 that we talk about. One is a project or program token template. That's basically the token. Some people want to use a DID. From a technical implementation, we don't get to that level. We basically say, what are the properties we need to collect to represent uniquely a project or program that's going to issue claims of some sort of benefit, whether it's carbon or water or some other sustainable attribute or behavior or activity. The second is the actual claim that a project or program would make. And that's a specific claim type against a standard. And the third one is the ecological benefit token template. That's the template that would be created, a carbon credit of some type is based off of the ecological benefit token template, which can then be refactored and reused for water claims and water credits or some other environmental factor. The relationship between those in this verification contract basically dictates the relationship and the flow for how you get from a project establishing itself, issuing claims that then turn into an issued token. So as we go through, let's talk about the ecological project or program, or short for EP. And this will give you an idea of the high level. It's implementation neutral, so we don't go in and specify any code, but we want to capture the business requirements here. So we do talk about, is this a token fungible or not? Is it transferable and burnable? And we talk about properties, which in TTF speak is a property set, which is essentially a collection of reusable properties. So verified link is one that is used all over the place. It's essentially how do you record or reference data that's not stored on the ledger, but link to it in a verifiable way and be able to have the evidence where you could make sure that that data hasn't been tampered with once it was stored off the chain. So you can essentially use some hashing to give you some verification of that. Anyway, I'm not going to read all of these. You can see the way we've structured this. We have ecological project that can have multiple benefit project types. That was the other thing that we thought is turns out that ecological projects might want to create carbon credits for both removals and reductions, which are different types of carbon credits. And they might also want to do a water issue water benefit claims. So then they can have 3 separate modular benefit projects, because the modular benefit project vary by the type of claim that they're issuing. And those are the modular benefit project turns out to be what is contracted against. Sorry, skipping around here. The modular benefit project issues these benefit claims, and the benefit claim is essentially just another token that is essentially a receipt for a claim. A claim usually has a lot of data behind it. So you see a lot of these verified links where you're verifying raw data. That might be like a ton of IoT sensor data over a 6-month period. It might be satellite weather data, other types of reference data you need to have bundled into your claim, but we're not going to store all that on the ledger. Rather, we're going to use the benefit claim as a receipt to track that claim through the process, and ultimately get the claim gets retired once a credit's issued to it, but it's linked to that, so you have an immutable sort of track and trace capability for these entities. The next you'll have is the ecological claim contract. This is the verification contract between the project, the modular benefit project, the VVB or the audit firm, and the standard registry. And that would be the organization that created the scientific-based standard and methodology that you're using to issue claims against. And it says things like, for this type of carbon sequestration claim, you need to collect IoT sensor data, every X acres of land, every week, and satellite data and weather data, and basically it describes what that data would be, and your claim has to essentially follow that that process. But the contract itself is that basic agreement that between the verifier and the issuer of the claims, that they will actually verify that, and if it's deemed to be valid, it will essentially create the next item, which is a carbon credit. And we've chosen to represent 2 different types and align with existing standards. So one of the organizations that spun up after we spun up the Sustainable Business Working Group was the Taskforce for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, or TSVCM. The TSVCM is an industry consortium, very large. It's like 350 different organizations. It's actually meeting right now, doing a summary. But what we did in IWA is we aligned our terminology with their recommendations and findings. So the core carbon principles, or CCP, is how we've chosen to tokenize, which they call a standard reference contract. We said, well, that's actually a token. So we created a token template called the CCP. And it is it lets you represent different types of both avoidance and reductions, and then has some categories. And this is what it looks like. It's an eye chart. It's kind of hard to fit on a single slide. It does have a lot of fields here, but it just some high level things. It's a fractionable fungible token. It has some new behaviors that's very similar to burning, but it's called revoke and replace, which has this replacement behavior that is needed for something called carbon dioxide removals. It has a bunch of properties and the different value types. These properties are coming from requirements from either the verifier, the standard registry, or the buyer wanting to be able to see these data values when they look at the token itself. You'll see as we move through, the other token that we have is around removals. And this is a little bit of debate going on at the TSVCM in the industry as a whole. Is there's a big desire in financial services to concentrate liquidity behind a single core reference contract called the CCP, the core carbon principles. However, as a buyer, and when we say concentrate liquidity, it's basically they want to create a fungible contract, which lends itself well to a lot of carbon credits. The vast majority of existing credits out there can fall into the fungible rate, where you're looking at MT CO2 equivalent, or CO2e for some sort of greenhouse gas. If it's 1 metric ton of CO2e, then it's fungible with any other 1 metric ton of CO2e. That works okay for removals, so you're just for avoiding. So for traditional um, sort of sustainable practices, but with the um, the goals that we've set, and a lot of the organizations set, like at Microsoft, we set a removal goal. We want to be not just carbon neutral, we're going to be carbon negative. So we made the goal of 2030, we're going to actually be carbon negative. That means we can't just purchase avoidances or removals, or reductions. We have to go after removals. And we think removals are NFTs or non-fungible with each other because of the, for example, the cost of creating a removal using direct air capture is a very costly process, but we might want to pay more for and invest more and send more investment dollars towards those types of credits, even though the CO2e is equivalent to maybe a forestry project that's removing CO2e. Or actually, we're doing all of the above, but it just gives you an example where you can compare two carbon removal units, or CRUs, that we've defined, that have the same MT CO2, the same CO2 equivalent value, but that the way that they were generated differs, and thus they'll be priced differently and valued differently. So those won't line up to focus liquidity. So anyway, we're in the IWA, we're sort of having a specification for both. And then as implementations come out and they practice against these, we'll figure out, in reality, which method actually works the best. And if the two can actually coexist together, which we think the market, any good implementation following the specs can actually have multiple versions or multiple different types of benefit tokens that are created, and then buyers can peruse them and pick the ones that meet their sustainability goals and to offset the activities that they're desired to offset. This is how these things fit together. This is sort of pointing at, and the idea here is that the tokens and the contracts all relate to each other, so one leads to the next. So you have this sort of life cycle of these tokens that are connected to each other. And again, this is done in a way a lot of the business people kind of get these diagrams. And depending on how the implementation is done, it's either done automatically or you have to do have certain fields. You may not need certain fields in certain implementations. That's okay. But for the business folks, this really lets them sort of visualize how these different tokens and contracts work together. And then when they're placed on a ledger and a mutable ledger, they'll be able to then have the ability to get a view for the buyer to be able to adequately compare and judge quality quickly without having to do what we did. We went through months long RFP process just to source our own removals, which is not something we could do at scale. So we wanted to make sure that we create product in the pipeline out there to represent that. So that workflow, we do have these high-level workflows. I'm not going to walk through this, but just give you an idea. In the Interwork Alliance, we're not using workflow tools and any sort of languages, literally PowerPoint, showing these flows and putting some brief descriptions in is enough to tease out from the business people the actual requirements within these sub workflows, and we can define those to be able to get the detailed contract flow end to end. And that was the thing that was sort of another aha moment is what are these best practices to get the requirements out of all these different parties in a format that isn't intimidating, that lends itself for them to take offline and contribute and add comments out of band and send it back in and contribute that way. And these high-level workflows let us sort of capture that feedback from our participants. So as we move forward, that was just the supply phase, right? So that took a long time to get to. Next, we moved to demand, and demand is all about establishing some of the pain points for corporates that are doing voluntary emissions reporting is where do they report? how do they report, and then how do they track their progress. Everyone's made these sustainability commitments, but they actually have no idea how they're going to achieve it, how they're going to be evaluated on it. They are all, their board level knows that if you're publicly traded, investor funds and rating agencies are looking at your activities, and we'll grade you on that. So we came up with this thing called an ESG scorecard. Probably a bad name, but it basically allows a corporate to come in and write their pledge down in a contract with themselves. So the ESG scorecard is essentially a smart contract with yourself, and then an optional auditor. If you're going to enlist that, you're going to actually go the full distance of having not only reporting your emissions, but having an auditor attest to those on the same scorecard. But the scorecard is very simple. It lets you establish, a scorecard for your company. You can report. For example, as Microsoft, we would create ours and say we're going to be carbon negative by 2030. So our Q1 2030 will be a negative number for our emissions. And then we'll have a reporting period created for each reporting period, which we're ambitiously putting quarterly, which right now it's annual, but we think if we get disciplined enough as an industry, we can align it with financial reporting. So it will create placeholders for forecasts to be placed. So enterprises can go in and say, my goal 2030 is to be here. I should be able to forecast each reporting period where I should be. And in that forecast, give some demand signal of any offsetting that I have to do there. What percentage will be of the different types? What percentage of removals versus reductions? And then each one, you can see it nest down and get more and more granular about the demand signal we're sending to suppliers. Here's an example what that would look like. Again, very rough, just showing some simple tables where, reporting period has a unique ID, it has a date, you have your goal. The idea is when you actually calculate your emissions for that reporting period, you record it side by side. The goal and the actual gives you an effective, the spread, if you will, the gap that you have to net out. So that's how much you have to go out into the market and acquire carbon credits to then spend to offset your emissions. And then you can go out and shop. Once you find your carbon credits and you're spending them, you spend them and you provide the unique ID of the reporting period that you're applying it to. And then we get a detailed record of not only how you achieved your effective emissions of whatever your goal was that reporting period, but then the granular information about what types of carbon credits you applied, what kind of projects they came from, what methods they were used. So it's very, very detailed. That ledger entry is actually very useful because then it's less subjective. When someone's evaluating your ESG progress from the outside, you can point to them as, here's the evidence of my progress, and it solves a problem on that reporting side and closes out the life cycle for us. So we sort of covered that sort of offsetting as you go out and you purchase credits on the market, you essentially spend them towards your ESG goals, that your contract that you have on the network. And this sort of shows the workflows are very, very simple, and that's by design. Now, what we've done in the back end as we've gotten these flows, I'll show you some of these, is we created using the TTF, and Connor's been working on the Interwork framework, but basically creating the structured requirements and the specifications. If you haven't learned about the TTF, you can go out on GitHub and check that out to see where we are on that. So the last thing I want to talk about here briefly is some of the lessons learned. So we do have multi-party collaboration lessons learned about what not to do. The first is, don't assume everyone knows GitHub. That was one of the big things. We like to use GitHub to collect all of our multi-party documentation and best practices to see how those things go. But instead, what we wanted to use is to use Word, PowerPoint, Google Docs, and let the business people use the tools that they're familiar with. And then on the back end, you have to get your technical folks to sort of translate that and put it into the TTF into the GitHub itself. And then again, really focus on the business discussions as much as you can, and stay out of the technical weeds. We've seen lots of the business people that are contributing sort of glaze over when people start talking about implementation details for specific versions of Ethereum or some other distributed ledger. We need to really focus on, let's get those requirements from them, and then put them in a format where we can then go do the implementation and then differentiate at that level once we get there. The GitHub link is down there at the bottom, that you can go check out the all of the detail that's behind this slide deck that I can't possibly cover in this short amount of period of time. But I did want to leave it here for Q&A and let us get started there.
Thanks, Marley. Did anyone have any questions they wanted to start with here? If not, I'll start by, I'll kick it off with Marley. You provided details of the GitHub there, but I'm sure there's lots of people who are here who are interested in finding out more about how they can get involved with this. Beyond the GitHub repo, what are some, for the IWA, what are some of the other resources that you'd recommend people who are new to the space or just curious to learn more? Yeah,
that's one of the things that if you're curious about the space and you're just wanting to get up to speed, that link, this particular link right here, the sustainability, that's actually a documentation that's easy to sort of digest and get you familiar with the lingo. It has a glossary there as well, which is a good place to sort of, when you hear a term and you're not exactly sure what it is, you can check that out. The others are, the information out there. I would encourage you to look at the NGOs and the standards to see like Gold Standard and Vera, organizations that have been doing this for a while, but don't just stay there. Those organizations have been there a while and they have a lot of legacies they're trying to pull forward. And we need to be cognizant of pulling forward legacy, but we also need to think about how this should be done right the first time, because it does have a legacy of and a lack of trust. And we have the tools of the distributed ledger technology to be able to instill trust, improve it. But if we don't build it the right way, even the best distributed ledger or blockchain won't solve the trust problem unless we sort of are disciplined about making sure we don't take any shortcuts, which is tempting to do in this space, like rolling out an implementation without fully understanding the requirements.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? This is Jordan. I actually built a monitoring system for solar power plants overseas in Macedonia for someone who's maintaining them. Instead of going on terrain, they see what's going on in real time. So I have record for every kilowatt produced and every outage and everything that's happening in real time. How would I start integrating something like this into it? Basically, I could write a smart contract and start, do a Web3 connection to it. Is there anywhere I could start with this?
Yeah, I mean, you're basically describing that generic MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification process, which is you're collecting the raw data to be able to issue a claim.
Yeah.
So that's the on-ramp for those types of things. So when you look at the process that we laid out in the sustainability working group, is that you first have to define a project or a program. Right now, you do that through a registry. We're trying to get to the point where you can do it in one place. Pick a standard that you're going to issue claims against. There's a lot of those out there, so you could probably have a choice of that type of data. So pick one, and then figure out how you're going to take that MRV data and package it up, and then essentially issuing the claim. There's a ton of work in that space. That MRV space is actually much bigger than I think than just getting the carbon credit process started, because there's so many different ways of creating credits that when I talk to startups or people are looking for opportunities, that's where I point them. It's like, don't try to create the underlying financial infrastructure to rule the world of carbon credits, but rather building solutions that can generate valid claims and use the principles that we have in blockchain technology to prove that stuff and plug those frameworks in. There's just a ton ton of innovation that needs to happen there.
So today there is nothing in place they could let me integrate?
There's not an existing, you have some implementations out there, some programs, but most of them are just getting off the ground. In the next year, there'll probably be a different story, but right now you basically have to go to a marketplace, and then they will prescribe for you a standard that you need to adhere to, and it's probably going to be a manual process and not fully digital end to end, which is, that's one of the drawbacks. Is a lot of people are spending more. It costs them more to produce a carbon credit than the credit actually generates for them.
Thank you.
A question from Mohan. Can you comment on the complexity of the workflows and if this was difficult to implement in DLT? I guess they're still being implemented, but certainly, what are your views on the workflows, Marley?
Yeah, the complexity does get kind of complex. It's kind of weird. It will increase the more you actually move from the specification into your implementation itself. But for the most part, they're pretty straightforward. Once everyone agrees on the process, the way we design the stuff in the IWA is a lot of the moving parts are actually pluggable pieces, like the standard that you're using to issue claims against. Rather than coming with a process for all the 50 different standards that could be there, let's generically say you're going to have a plugin of a standard. Your claim is going to point to the type of standard that you're issuing claims against, and make those modular as modular concepts. The complexity of plugging those in, especially when some of these standards are not built to be digital first, they're very much spreadsheet driven, human labor intensive integration stuff that you have to put in, which is not optimal. So there's a lot of work that's going in to sort of digitize sort of end to end that MRV process. So there's a lot of complexity there, but we try to abstract that a little bit using the frameworks. And again, there's not like a holistic implementation out there that we can point to as like wholly successful, and all the buyers are going to, especially for carbon dioxide removals, there is no, that infrastructure is to be built. Another question, this one from Christian Feld. Zooming out, is there any roadmap in mind here where you think these tools might be applied? Sorry, when you think these tools might be applied? Yeah, I think once we get the standards settled down, I think you'll start to, it'll be good to see some implementations based off the standard and, encouraging those. So we do have, participants in the IWA that are looking to implement these. You have to make sure that you don't, rush to implementation without, and missing some critical piece of information, which is very tempting to do. A lot of this, frankly, a lot of the things that are happening now is all geared towards an event in November called COP26, which is the meeting of the UNFCCC. It's basically the Paris Agreement, where the next set of rules coming together. So all the standards, including the TSVCM, the Interwork Alliance, are all trying to get out in front of that to get some structure in place, so that when the COP26 rolls around, there are tools and building blocks sitting around that we can pick up and plug in, and we're going to get a lot more clarity after COP26, the lay of the land, and I suspect that we're going to have a lot of implementations accelerating after that point. Thanks, Marley. If everyone could give Marley a virtual round of applause. It's an amazing space in terms of, right now with all the emphasis there is on these initiatives, but also the potential for DLT to actually support a lot of this innovation. Encourage you to dig more, and I'm sure Marley would be happy to chat to people if they want to find out more. Next month's meetup, in order to be as inclusive as possible to different geographies and time zones, we're actually going to be running the next meetup at a APAC friendly time zone, and so that's happening on Wednesday the 28th of April at 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. British summertime. So we're going to have Eugene Asiv, the CTO and co-founder at Chainstack, talking. So Chainstack are one of the leading blockchain infrastructure deployment platforms. And then if you just want to run up like a Corda, Ethereum, Fabric network on some
Amazon or Azure infrastructure, or just get someone to manage it for you. And that's really what they excel at. So he's going to be talking about what they're doing. And then also Peter Robinson as well, who's been at Consensus for a number of years and he has a cryptography background, and he's been going really deep in kind of research mode, and with his work at Consensus, and he's going to be talking about some of the great things he's been doing there.